I've worked with a lot of civil liberties and press freedom groups over the last 20 years during my work as a journalist. And one thing that I can say for certain about them as a collective is that it is almost impossible to get them to agree on anything, even things that would seem fundamental to their cause of press freedom or civil liberties. And yet, in early 2021, as Joe Biden assumed the office of the presidency, every single major press freedom and civil liberties group united and signed a common letter, sent it to the Biden Justice Department, urging the Justice Department to drop the prosecution of Julian Assange that began during the Trump administration, largely the work of Mike Pompeo, in order, they said, to avert what they described as the single greatest threat to press freedom in decades, the prosecution of Julian Assange. That prosecution, the indictment that they brought against him, essentially alleges that he committed espionage by engaging in the acts that all investigative journalists, by definition, engage in. And yet the Biden Justice Department ignored that letter. They forced Assange to stay in prison for more than 3 full years, a high-security supermax prison in Britain that the BBC calls British Guantanamo, and he was in a 2-by-3 meter cell for 23 hours a day in isolation, permitted to leave his cell only 1 hour per day, and his medical doctors and psychologists and psychiatrists all attested to the fact that he was suffering serious mental and physical health problems while in prison. He had a mini stroke, he had many heart problems, and that any attempt to extradite him to the United States would be something he almost would be certain to not survive. Now, the Biden administration, and we have been suggesting for quite a while that this is likely going to come, finally did agree to allow Julian Assange to leave that British prison and go back to Australia just a few months before the 2024 election. And they did so not because they dropped the lawsuit against Assange, but instead required that he plead guilty to 1 felony count under the Espionage Act so that they could say, look, we were right all along. Assange had not just engaged in traditional reporting, but instead, as he himself admits, he is guilty of espionage for the reporting that he did. Now, obviously, the reason Julian Assange agreed to that is because he had already lost 15 years of his life. He has 2 small children who have never seen him except behind prison glass. And it was time for him to recover his health and get on with his life. And I think unless you are somebody who has been in that position and has shown a willingness to sacrifice even more than Assange has, nobody has any standing to object to what Assange chose to do. But that doesn't mean that the decision they forced him into isn't incredibly dangerous to the press freedoms that the United States repeatedly claims around the world that it protects. There was a surprisingly good article in the New York Times today explaining in a very straightforward way, in a way that was obviously written for the liberal readers of that paper who have been trained to hate Assange as a Russian agent because of his reporting that he did in the 2016 election against Hillary Clinton, why it is that even if they hate Assange, they should understand how what the Biden administration did is such a grave threat to press freedom going forward. Here is the article. It's not an op-ed. It's by the New York Times reporter Charlie Savage. And you see there the headline, Assange plea deal sets a chilling precedent, but it could have been worse. Quote, the plea deal brings an ambiguous end to a legal saga that has jeopardized the ability of journalists to report on military intelligence or diplomatic information that officials deem secret. Quote, the plea deal Julian Assange, the founder of WikiLeaks, has reached with prosecutors is bad for American press freedom, bad for American press freedom. But the outcome also could have been worse. The result is an ambiguous end to a legal saga that has jeopardized the ability, we just read this whole entire part. Enshrined in the First Amendment, the rule of a free press is bringing to light information beyond what those in power approve for release. That is a foundational principle of American self-government. So let's just stop there for a minute. So many people who probably don't think of themselves as authoritarians believe that as long as the U.S. government takes a document that describes what it has done and stamps secret or top secret on it, it then becomes both immoral and illegal for any journalist or media outlet to publish that document, because the U.S. government has said this is a document that shall not be published, that we want to remain concealed from the public. Now, obviously, there are times that we're supposed to be exceptions when it's legitimate for the government to try and keep a document like that a secret. Just give you two examples. If the United States government is involved in a war and there are war plans by generals about where they're going to move troops is contained in a document, obviously there's a legitimate interest in the government that the government has in keeping that secret so that their adversaries in the war, their enemies in the war, don't know where their troops are going or what their war strategy is. If there is a grand jury investigation where someone is being investigated and yet not accused of any crime, you don't want any of that leaking because it can destroy the reputation of a person before they have even been charged with a crime, let alone convicted of one. So there are instances in which government secrecy, namely when the government describes a document as classified, is valid. But overwhelmingly, the rule is supposed to be, this is the rule of American democracy, and I would say suggest democracy in general, that we are supposed to know, with very rare exception, everything that our government is doing. That's why they're called public officials, working in the public sector with public power. It's essential to a democracy, not just to be able to go to vote for leaders, but to actually know what they've been doing so the decision is an informed one. And by contrast, the U.S. government, or governments in general in a democracy, are not supposed to know anything about the population, about their citizens. With very rare exceptions, when they get a search warrant, they're not supposed to be able to spy on us or keep dossiers on us or understand and learn everywhere we go and everything we do. And yet in American political culture over the last 30 years, this has become completely reversed. So that everything that the United States government does practically is automatically and reflexively marked secret or top secret, which means we know very little about what the U.S. government is doing other than what they want us to know by leaking to subservient reporters who just carry their message and convey it to the public. So we know almost nothing about what they're doing. They've built a wall of secrecy that is almost impenetrable. And at the same time, because of the mass surveillance system that they built aimed at the American population, they know everything that we're doing. It's a complete inversion of how a healthy democracy should function. And the purpose of investigative journalism, and the reason that WikiLeaks is so important and pioneering, is because WikiLeaks discovered a unique method for blowing a hole in that wall of secrecy that the United States government had constructed, namely that they created a system that would allow people inside the government to leak massive amounts of digital information that the public should have a right to know, and do so anonymously. That was WikiLeaks' and Julian Assange's most important and prescient innovation. And what the New York Times article is describing here, I think, is such an important point that I've seen liberals all day and media figures all day, wittingly or unwittingly, denying. As the New York Times says, enshrined in the First Amendment and the role of a free press is to bring to light information beyond what those in power approve for release. That's a foundational principle of American self-government. So if you believe that someone is immoral or guilty because they publish a document that the American government has marked secret or top secret, what you're essentially saying is the only things we have a right to know as citizens about our government is what our government decides they want us to think or believe or know. The whole point of a free press is to investigate and discover what the U.S. government is doing in secret, even if they don't want that information released. As the New York Times says, it's a foundational principle of American self-government. Yet I watch media figures, people who are supposed to understand and practice the core of the journalistic ethos, adopt the very warped view that the reason Julian Assange is a criminal and deserved to be in prison is because he published documents that the United States government had ordered be kept secret. An act, by the way, which every media outlet in this country regularly does. CNN constantly purports to disclose leaks of classified information. The New York Times does the same. The Washington Post does the same. And nobody ever calls for them to be imprisoned. In fact, the 2010 publication of Iraq and Afghanistan war logs and diplomatic cables that Assange was being prosecuted for were documents that he published in partnership with the New York Times and The Guardian and news outlets around the world like El País and others. And yet, nobody would ever call for the editors of the New York Times or The Guardian or El País to be prosecuted and put in a prison cell alongside Julian Assange, even though what they did is the same, because calling for the prosecution of the editors of those newspapers would reveal that these people are complete authoritarians. And they're cowards. They have too much fear to say, oh, the editors of the New York Times should be imprisoned because the New York Times has power in their world and Julian Assange does not. So the whole case against Julian Assange, the entire hatred that has been ginned up about him in establishment discourse, is all based on a refusal to accept this principle that, again, the New York Times, to its credit, laid out so eloquently, which is that the whole point of journalism is that you're supposed to tell the public the things the government doesn't want the public to know, not only the things that the government tells journalists to publish. Journalists who only tell the public things the government tells them to say are propagandists of the government. That's the vast majority of corporate media. And part of the reason so much of the corporate media hates Julian Assange and wants him in prison is because he serves as a mirror for what they really are. He actually does the kind of adversarial journalism they pretend to do. And as a result, he's broken more stories of more significance than all of them combined. And a major reason why they hate him so much and spend all day justifying his imprisonment is because he's not one of them and yet has done far more to advance the cause of journalism than they could ever do if they have 100 lifetimes. Here the New York Times article goes on, quote, assuming the judge accepts the agreement, it would mean that for the first time in American history, gathering and publishing information the government considers secret will have been successfully treated as a crime. This new precedent will send a threatening message to national security journalists who may be chilled in how aggressively they do their jobs because they will see a greater risk of prosecution. Now, let me just state here for clarity that a plea bargain is not itself anything that carries precedential value. It doesn't bind any future case where if a government indicts a journalist, the government can't say, oh, look, it was already decided that what we're claiming he did is a crime because Julian Assange pled guilty to it. In order to have a precedent, you need a court ruling. And the whole point of this plea bargain, and I think it's one of the reasons why the Biden administration did it, is because it avoided court rulings on whether any of these acts could be constitutionally criminalized. But what the New York Times is saying is that it now intimidates journalists and whistleblowers. And it says, look, we just put Assange in prison for effectively 15 years, and then at the end forced him to plead guilty to a felony. So if you want to actually publish our secrets, you should think again, because we've just proven to you the power that we have to destroy your life if we do it. The Times article goes on, quote, he's basically pleading guilty to things that journalists do all the time and need to do, said Jamil Jaffer, executive director of the Knight Foundation, the Knight First Amendment Institute at Columbia University. Quote, it will cast a shadow over press freedom, but not the same kind of a shadow that would have been cast by a judicial opinion holding that this activity is criminal and unprotected by the First Amendment. The narrow criminal information to which Mr. Assange has agreed to plead guilty centers on one count of conspiring to violate the Espionage Act. The court document says that Chelsea Manning, an Army intelligence analyst, and Mr. Assange agreed that she would send him national security files, even though he had no security clearance, and that he would then, quote, communicate them to others, namely the public, who were also not entitled to publish them, that is, publish them. In other words, what Julian Assange just pled guilty to under the Espionage Act is exactly what journalists do all the time. Now, I'm going to jump around a little bit because I just want to make this one point here. Back in 2019, when the indictment was announced of Julian Assange, and I read it, I wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post. And the title of it was, "The Indictment of Assange is a Blueprint for Making Journalists into Felons." And the subheadline was, "The First Amendment is meaningless if it only protects people the government recognizes as journalists." And the reason I said this, that this indictment threatens investigative journalism, is because the problem from the beginning with trying to prosecute Julian Assange, the Obama administration, the Justice Department really wanted to. And they looked for something that he did other than just receive information from a source, because they knew they couldn't prosecute him for that, because that's what journalists do every day. And they could never find anything that he did beyond receiving information from their source. So the Obama Justice Department concluded that they could not prosecute Julian Assange without also prosecuting the editors of every major newspaper who has done the same. And what the Trump administration did, the Trump Justice Department did, is it concocted two different acts that they claim Julian Assange did that went beyond mere receipt of classified information. One was that they accused him of having encouraged Chelsea Manning to find ways to avoid detection when she entered this system the next time, to try and help her evade passwords that would record that she was the one that was taking the information. And then the other thing they claimed that he did that went beyond mere receipt of classified information is that he encouraged her, once she brought him that first archive, to try and get other types of information. Now, the reason I immediately understood that this indictment was so dangerous and would criminalize all investigative journalism is because those two acts are things that investigative journalists do every day. There's no investigative journalism I've ever worked on where I didn't do the same two things. As a journalist, you have not only the right, but the duty to tell your source how to evade detection. If a source calls you on an open phone line and says, "Hey, I want to tell you about some government secrets," the first thing you do as a journalist, if you're ethical, is you say, "No, don't use an open phone line. Use Signal or use encryption. I don't want you to get caught." And if you go to the front page of any newspaper like the New York Times, the Washington Post, there are instructions that say, if you're inside the government and you want to pass us classified information, this is what you should avoid doing and this is what you should do instead. So encouraging sources, teaching sources how not to get caught while they're passing you classified information is what investigative journalists do all the time. It's their duty to do that. And if that now becomes a crime, meaning you somehow become part of the crime that the source is committing when you're telling them how to evade detection, that would criminalize all investigative journalism. And the same is true for the other act that they claimed was a crime that went which went beyond mere receipt of classified documents, which was to encourage a source to get you even more. So Chelsea Manning came to Julian Assange, said, "Here's this massive archive I have showing crimes of the US government." And then he said, "Well, this is great. Are there other things we can also get that are worth reporting?" I have never in my life worked with a source who brought me information where I didn't say, "Well, this is really good. Can you also get X, Y, and Z?" Every investigative journalist does that immediately when a source comes to you. So again, if that also is the basis for turning someone who publishes classified information into being a criminal, that gives you the right to criminalize all investigative journalism. Now, the thing I want to note about that Washington Post article was that I published it in May of 2019. And as it turned out, in June of 2019, the next month, I began reporting a major investigative expose with my colleagues here in Brazil that had a massive impact on Brazil. It changed the course of Brazilian history. It led to the release of Lula da Silva from prison and a variety of other impact. And I had a source who came to me and said, "I've hacked into the telephones of the top prosecutors and judges, and it proves that they engaged in corruption and illegality when prosecuting a bunch of people, including Lula." And one of the things I did was say, "Well, you have to be careful not to get caught." And the other thing I said was, "Well, do you have any other things beyond what you've given me? And because this was all recorded by text, when they found the source and arrested the source, and they found those communications I had with him, that was when the Brazilian government then prosecuted me, then brought a criminal indictment against me, charging me with 126 felony counts on the ground that they used the exact theory that the US government used to try and prosecute Assange, namely that by orienting my source on how to avoid detection and then asking the source if there was other information they could get, that I had become part of the criminal conspiracy. Now, fortunately, in my case, the Brazilian Supreme Court intervened very quickly after I was indicted and said that trying to prosecute me on those grounds would violate the free speech guarantee of the Brazilian Constitution. And I believe that should have been the same result had Julian Assange come to the United States, and for once and for all, a court would have ruled that you cannot prosecute a publisher of classified information, but because of this plea deal, the government got to avoid any ruling on that, which I think is one of their motives for wanting to put an end to this case, aside from the fact that they never wanted Assange on American soil because of the spectacle it would produce, because of the dangers of putting him on the stand, because of Biden's risk of being the first ever president to preside over the imprisonment in the United States of not a leaker inside the government, but of a person who just published classified information. But it's amazing that I wrote this article in the Washington Post in 2019 arguing that this theory jeopardizes all investigative journalists, and then the next year, the Brazilian government tried to prosecute me based on exactly this theory. Because again, there is no investigative journalism that does not involve the acts set forth in this indictment. Now, I want to just go through a little bit of the critical history of the Assange case and the WikiLeaks case, because it's something that I've been reporting on for a long time. In fact, the very first time that I reported on WikiLeaks was back in March of 2010 when I was at Salon. I was a writer and a reporter for Salon.com. And this was before any of the big WikiLeaks releases, like the Afghanistan war logs or Iraq war logs or the diplomatic cables. And I wrote this article, the headline of which was "The War on WikiLeaks and Why It Matters. The U.S. government escalates its campaign to harass and destroy a key whistleblower site." So I had seen all the way back in 2010 the massive value and potential that what Julian Assange created at WikiLeaks had for the cause of journalism. And I interviewed Julian Assange as part of this article. And the reason I actually wrote this article was because there was a short article in the New York Times that had reported that the Pentagon had classified WikiLeaks as an official threat to national security, and that there was a top secret report they prepared which talked about how to destroy WikiLeaks with all different methods. They talked about how they might submit false information to WikiLeaks in the hope that they would publish it and that would forever destroy their reputation. And I remember thinking, wow, if the US military and government thinks this site is that much of an enemy and a threat to it simply because they're publishing and reporting on secret information, that's a site that I probably would be interested in. And I interviewed Julian at the time as part of writing this article, and this is part of what he told me. If we can put that on the screen, it said, he said to me when I asked him about what the project of WikiLeaks was, he said, quote, "The information has reform potential," meaning releasing classified information has the potential for reform. And the information which is concealed or suppressed is concealed or suppressed because the people who know it best understand that it has the ability to reform. So they engage in work to prevent that reform. And then he went on, "There are reasons I do it that have to do with wanting to reform civilization, and selectively targeting information will do that. Understanding that quality information is what every decision is based on, and all the decisions taken together is what, quote, civilization is. So if you want to improve civilization, you have to remove some of the basic constraints, which is the quality of information that civilization has at its disposal to make decisions." And then he went on and said, "Of course, there's a personal psychology to it, that I enjoy crushing bastards. I like a good challenge, and do a lot of the, and so do a lot of the other people in WikiLeaks. We like the challenge. But the vision of WikiLeaks was that if you can liberate information that the public has the right to know, you could then encourage and incite the population to demand changes and reform. And that was precisely, he said, why all of this information was being kept secret by governments and power centers, because they understood the potential for that information to foster social and political change. Here's the New York Times article I was referring to that prompted me to write about WikiLeaks and interview Assange. There you see it. From March of 2010, the Pentagon sees a threat from online muckrakers. And it talked about how this report was prepared inside the Pentagon, and true to WikiLeaks' mission, they got that report and they were able to publish it. And it showed what the US military was willing to do to try and destroy WikiLeaks. Now, as I said, in 2010, when WikiLeaks really did its first kind of major publication of secrets, and the amount of stories contained in those releases are too numerous to chronicle. I've written long articles just showing some of the crucial revelations that WikiLeaks was able to publish based on this archive, including all kinds of hidden war crimes by the US in Afghanistan and Iraq, as well as all sorts of secret corruption on the part of many governments around the world. And the Obama administration was furious. After all, part of what they published were Hillary Clinton's diplomatic cables, the diplomatic cables of the State Department under Hillary Clinton. And there have been reports where she said, why can't we just go and drone Julian Assange? The Obama administration was obsessed with prosecuting Julian Assange. They convened a grand jury. They called witnesses. But at the end of the process, here's Time Magazine in 2013 reporting on it. The U.S. says WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange is unlikely to face charges. Fears that the Department of Justice would have to prosecute news organizations as well. Quote, the problem the Department of Justice has always had in investigating Julian Assange is there is no way to prosecute him for publishing information with the same theory being applied to journalists, a former department spokesman said. Quote, and if you are not going to prosecute journalists for publishing classified information, which the department is not going to do, then there is no way to prosecute Assange. Now, that was always the theory that led to the Obama Justice Department, who desperately wanted to put Assange in prison, to say we can't. How do we differentiate between what Assange did and what the media outlets with whom he partnered did? We can't. And it was the Trump administration in 2018 under Mike Pompeo, when Trump made Mike Pompeo the director of the CIA in 2017. He was a standard warmonger and neocon, one of the many who ended up in the Trump administration. And I think that was one of Trump's greatest failures, was putting a bunch of people. Remember, he made Nikki Haley the ambassador to the UN, put John Bolton as a White House advisor. He had all kinds of neocons and warmongers and people he said he opposed in high positions of influence and power, and Mike Pompeo was probably the worst. And when Mike Pompeo arrived in 2017 as the director of the CIA, he gave a speech early on in April of 2017, 3 months into the Trump presidency, where he vowed that no matter what, he would destroy WikiLeaks and put an end to this view that WikiLeaks has the right of press freedom, saying they do not, and we will never stop until we destroy Julian Assange. And then the Trump administration under Pompeo went to work. At the time, Julian Assange was in the Ecuadorian embassy, where he had gotten asylum from the Ecuadorian government for reasons we explained last night. It was not because he was hiding from a sex assault investigation in Sweden. It was because he was willing to go to Sweden as long as the Swedish government promised that they would not use his presence on Swedish soil to turn him over to the United States. And when Sweden refused, and Ecuador offered the same thing, Ecuador said, if you just promise to not turn him over to the Americans by virtue of his presence on Swedish soil, we'll withdraw the asylum and he'll get on the next plane to Sweden. He never was concerned about those sex charges at all. And it was when the Swedish government refused and he became obviously rightfully scared that the plan really was to get him onto U.S. soil and put him in a prison for the rest of his life. That's when he sought refuge in the Ecuadorian embassy. And he was there from 2012 until 2018, when Trump officials led by Mike Pompeo bullied and coerced and threatened and bribed the new Ecuadorian government to withdraw its protection of asylum, which allowed the British police, the London police, to march into the embassy in 2018, arrest Assange, and put him in that high security prison. And he was charged with bail jumping. That was the only crime of which he was ever convicted. It's a misdemeanor. He was sentenced to 51 weeks, less than a year, because you can't put him under a misdemeanor. Under British law, you can't give a sentence more than a year. He served that in 11 months. And right as he was about to get released, that was when the Trump administration unveiled the indictment against Assange to make sure that he stayed in prison. And then they knew there'd be this lengthy fight over whether the British would extradite Assange to stand trial in the United States, and that while he was fighting that extradition, they convinced the British to keep him in a high security prison and not let him out on bail. And he spent the last 5 years in this high security prison, not because he had been convicted of any crime, but because the British refused to let him out, even with ankle monitors and all kinds of conditions to ensure he didn't flee, because the United States wanted him rotting in prison, because the goal was always to crush Julian Assange and prevent WikiLeaks from ever returning. And one of the effects of this was that the United States has completely lost its ability, as has the UK, to go around the world lecturing other countries on their attacks on press freedom, to pretend that the United States is somehow the beacon of press freedom. Here is a BBC interview with the very authoritarian president of Azerbaijan. And Azerbaijan is a country that was known for curbing press freedom, for imprisoning dissidents. And the BBC British reporter went there to try and pompously lecture President Aliyev about Azerbaijan on their refusal to honor press freedoms, and listen to what the president said in return.
Why do you think that people in Azerbaijan do not have free media and opposition?
Because this is what I'm told by independent...
Well, let's see if we can get that volume up, and I'm just going to read it for anyone listening on podcast. She said, why do you think the people in Azerbaijan do not have free media and opposition?
What I'm told by independent sources in this country.
Which independent sources?
Many independent sources.
Tell me which.
I certainly couldn't
actually,
name
this is in
sources.
English, so let's just turn the volume up so people can hear, and let's start over, and let's just listen to what the effect of Assange's imprisonment has been all over the world.
Do you think that people in Azerbaijan do not have free media and opposition?
Because this is what I'm told by independent sources in this country.
Which independent sources?
Many independent sources.
Tell me which.
I certainly couldn't name sources.
Oh, if you couldn't name, that means that you're just inventing the story.
So you're saying the media is not under state control?
Not at all.
I mean, NGOs are the subject of a crackdown. Journalists are the subject of a crackdown.
Not at all.
Critics are in jail.
No, not at all.
None of this is true.
Absolutely fake. Absolutely. We have free media. We have free internet. And the number of internet users in Azerbaijan is more than 80%. Can you imagine the restriction of media in a country where internet is free, there is no censorship, and there are 80% of internet users? This is, again, a biased approach. This is an attempt to create a perception in Western audience about Azerbaijan. We have opposition, we have NGOs, we have free political activity, we have free media, we have freedom of speech. But if you raise this question, can I ask you also one? How do you assess what happened to Mr. Assange? Is it a reflection of free media in your country? Let's talk about Assange. How many years he spent in Ecuadorian embassy? And for what? And where is he now? For journalistic activity. You kept that person hostage, actually killing him morally and physically. You did it, not us, and now he's in prison. So you have no moral right to talk about free media when you do these things.
I mean, you can think whatever you want about Azerbaijan. As I said, I would not want to live there. It's a repressive country, to be sure. But what moral right or credibility do British and American journalists have to go around the world and lecture any other country about their attack on press freedoms when the United States and the British jointly kept in prison for almost 15 years, effectively, if you count Ecuadorian detention, almost 6 years of actual prison in the UK, a journalist who did nothing other than do journalism and expose the crimes of the US and British governments. And that's exactly the kind of loss of credibility that the United States is suffering all over the world. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.